Some memories don't disappear, they wait for the right moment to be found. The soft hum of the penthouse elevator faded behind Naomi Brooks as she stepped into the quiet, marble-floored apartment that still didn't feel like home, the city of Manhattan glowing beneath floor-to-ceiling windows like a promise she wasn't sure she believed in yet. The contract marriage had been signed only 72 hours ago, and already the silence between her and Ethan Caldwell felt heavier than the skyline itself, controlled, deliberate, untouched by warmth. She slipped off her heels. By the door, placing them neatly beside his polished Italian shoes, everything about this place spoke of precision and power, from the glass surfaces to the muted tones of grey and black, nothing out of place, nothing accidental, just like him. Naomi exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders as if she could shake off the weight of being watched even when he wasn't there, because somehow, impossibly, she always felt like he was watching, studying, remembering, and that thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She moved toward the living room, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the grand piano she had never seen him play, her reflection staring back at her in the dark polished surface, composed, calm, dignified, exactly who she had trained herself to be. But beneath that stillness something restless stirred, something she couldn't name. Her gaze shifted when she noticed his jacket draped over the back of a chair, charcoal grey, perfectly tailored, the kind of jacket that never wrinkled, never faltered. She hesitated for a moment, then reached for it, not out of curiosity, she told herself, but out of instinct, to place it properly, to maintain order in a world that felt quietly off balance. As her fingers closed around the fabric, something slipped from the inner pocket and landed softly against the hardwood floor, the sound barely audible, but enough to stop her breath. Naomi froze, her pulse quickening in a way she couldn't explain. Then slowly, deliberately, she bent down and picked it up, a leather wallet, smooth, worn just enough to suggest it was used often. She should have put it back, she knew that. Boundaries were clear in their agreement, no intrusion, no assumptions, no emotional entanglements, but some quiet pull she couldn't reason with, kept her from letting go. Her thumb brushed against the edge, and before she could stop herself, she opened it. Inside were the expected things: credit cards, identification, everything aligned, everything controlled, until her eyes landed on the photo tucked carefully into a hidden sleeve. Her breath caught, her fingers tightening around the leather as the world seemed to narrow into that single frame. It was her, there was no doubt about that. Her face, her eyes, the exact curve of her expression. But the moment she looked closer, a chill moved through her, slow and precise, because the woman in the photo wasn't the woman she knew herself to be. She was standing beneath golden lights, wearing a deep emerald dress that shimmered like something out of a dream, elegant, unfamiliar, impossible. Naomi's heart pounded, each beat echoing louder in the silence around her. She had never owned that dress, never worn anything like it, never stood in a place like that, and yet there she was, captured perfectly, as if the moment had been real, as if it had belonged to her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the photo over, searching for something, a date, a clue, anything that could anchor this image in reality. But there was nothing, just the faint imprint of time pressed into paper. She swallowed, her mind racing through every logical explanation: mistaken identity, manipulation, coincidence, but none of them settled, none of them felt right, because the more she looked, the more she recognized something deeper than resemblance. It was her, not just her face, but her presence, her stillness, the quiet strength she carried even when no one was looking, the kind of detail no stranger could replicate. A soft sound behind her broke the silence, the subtle click of a door closing. Naomi straightened instantly, her grip tightening around the wallet as she turned. Ethan stood at the entrance of the living room, his presence filling the space without effort, his expression composed, unreadable, but his eyes, those steady, storm grey eyes, were locked on her, not surprised, not confused, but focused, as if he had expected this moment, as if he had been waiting for it. The city lights reflected faintly in his gaze, making it impossible to tell where the distance ended and something else began. Naomi lifted the photo slightly, her voice calm, controlled, but edged with something sharper beneath, something that refused to be silenced. "This isn't just a picture," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "This is me, in a life I don't remember living." The silence stretched between them like glass, fragile and sharp, but neither of them moved to break it first. Ethan's gaze did not waver from her face, steady, measured, as if he had rehearsed this exact moment long before it ever happened. Naomi felt it then, that unsettling certainty that this was not a discovery for him, it was a confirmation. Her fingers tightened slightly around the wallet as she took a step forward, her posture still composed but her eyes searching, demanding something. Real beneath the calm surface he wore so effortlessly. "You are going to explain this," she said, her voice even, controlled, but carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in surprise, not in frustration, but as if releasing something he had been holding for a long time. He crossed the room with unhurried steps, each movement precise, deliberate, stopping just close enough to reach the photo but not taking it from her. "Not yet, there are things you would not understand," he replied, his voice low, smooth, but lacking the cold edge she had come to expect. Naomi's jaw tightened slightly, a flicker of something sharper passing through her eyes. "Try me," she answered, because she refused to be managed, refused to be kept in the dark like a variable in one of his carefully controlled equations. Ethan studied her for a moment, really studied her, as if searching for something beneath her words. Something that would tell him how far he could go, how much he could say. And then something shifted, subtle but undeniable. His hand lifted, not to take the wallet, but to lightly touch the edge of the photograph, his fingers brushing it with a familiarity that made Naomi's chest tighten in a way she could not explain. "You always hated that color," he said quietly, almost to himself. Naomi blinked, the words hitting her with a strange dissonance. "I have never worn this," she replied immediately, holding the photo up slightly, the emerald fabric catching the soft light from the city beyond the windows. Not once. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line, not in disagreement, but in something closer to conflict, as if the truth lived somewhere between what she remembered and what he knew. "No," he said after a moment, his voice steady again, controlled. "You do not remember it." The distinction settled heavily between them. Naomi's breath slowed, her mind racing through the implication. Not remembering was not the same as not happening. And that difference was enough to send a quiet unease through her entire body. "Stop speaking in riddles," she said, her tone sharpening just slightly, not losing control, but no longer allowing him to dictate the rhythm of this conversation. "You married me under a contract, you brought me into your life with rules and boundaries, and now I find this." She lifted the wallet just enough to emphasize the point. "You do not get to tell me I would not understand. You either trust me with the truth or you admit that this entire arrangement is built on something you are not willing to face." The words landed with precision, each one placed exactly where it needed to be, and for the first time since she had known him, Ethan did not respond. Immediately, the silence that followed was different now, not controlled, not calculated, but uncertain. His gaze dropped briefly to the photograph before returning to her, and there it was again, that look, not of a man seeing something new, but of someone recognizing something he had already lost once. 3 years ago, he began slowly, the words deliberate, measured as if choosing them carefully could keep something from unraveling. "I attended a charity gala in Chicago." Naomi's brow furrowed slightly, the detail unexpected, but she said nothing, allowing him to continue. "It was not an event I wanted to attend, but it was necessary. Appearances always are." A faint, almost humorless breath left him before he continued. "That night, I saw you." Naomi's heart skipped, just once, sharp and undeniable, but she held his gaze, unflinching. "That is not possible," she said, not dismissing him, but grounding herself in what she knew to be true. "I have never been to Chicago." Ethan nodded once, as if he had expected that answer, as if he had heard it before. "That is what makes this complicated," he replied, his voice quieter now, the edges of control softening into something more human, more uncertain. "Because I did not just see you." His hand moved again, this time taking the photograph gently from her fingers, holding it between them like something fragile, something that carried more weight than paper should. "I spoke to you, Naomi." The word settled into the space between them, undeniable, impossible. "You wore that dress." His eyes flickered to the image, then back to her, searching, hoping. "And you told me something I have not been able to forget since." Naomi felt the ground beneath her shift, not physically, but in the quiet, internal way that happens when certainty begins to fracture. Her mind pushed back, resisting, searching for logic, for reason, for anything that could anchor her to what she knew. "What did I say?" she asked, her voice softer now, not weaker, but drawn into the gravity of the moment despite herself. Ethan's gaze held hers, steady, unwavering, but there was something else there now, something she had not seen before, something unguarded. "You said," he paused, just for a second, as if the memory carried weight even now, "that some people do not meet by accident." His grip on the photograph tightened slightly, not enough to crease it, but enough to reveal the tension beneath his calm exterior. "They meet because something in the past refused to let them go." The words lingered in the air, quiet but powerful, and Naomi felt it then, not recognition, not memory, but something deeper, something that did not belong to logic or explanation. Something that made her chest tighten and her breath slow, as if her body was responding to something her mind could not yet reach. She looked at the photograph again, at the woman who looked exactly like her but lived in a moment she could not recall, and for the first time since she had found it, she did not try to deny it. She simply asked the only question that mattered now. "If that was me," she said, her voice steady despite the storm building beneath it, "then why do I not remember you?" The question did not echo, it settled, quiet and immovable, as if the entire room had been waiting for it to be asked. Ethan did not look away, but something in his expression shifted, not in defense, not in denial, but in recognition of a truth he could no longer contain within silence. His hand lowered slightly, the photograph still held between his fingers, as if letting it go too quickly would erase the only proof he had. That the moment he remembered had ever existed, "because you were not supposed to forget," he said finally, his voice calm but carrying a weight that pressed into the space between them. Naomi felt her breath catch, just for a fraction of a second, before she steadied herself again, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. "That is not an answer," she replied, though her voice was softer now, less confrontational, more searching. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the truth of that, then he moved past her, not abruptly, not avoiding her, but creating space as he walked toward the window, the city stretching endlessly beneath him, lights flickering like distant signals in the dark. He stood there for a moment, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, layered over the skyline, before he spoke again. "The night I met you," he began, his tone measured, each word chosen carefully, "you were not alone." Naomi's brow furrowed slightly, her mind trying to follow a path. She had no memory of walking. "You were leaving," he continued, "not the event, but something else, something bigger. I could see it in the way you moved, like you were already halfway gone." Naomi felt something shift inside her, not a memory, not yet, but a sensation, faint and distant, like standing at the edge of something she could not fully see. "And you stopped me," Ethan added, turning slightly now, his eyes finding hers again. "You asked me a question no one had ever asked me before." Naomi crossed her arms lightly, not defensive, but grounding herself. "What question?" she asked, her voice steady. Ethan's lips curved faintly, not into a smile, but into something quieter, something closer to respect. "You asked me if everything I built was worth the parts of myself I had to leave behind to get there." The word settled between them, and Naomi felt it again, that strange pull, that sense of familiarity that had no foundation in her memory, but lived somewhere deeper. Somewhere instinctive. She exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping briefly to the floor before returning to him. "That does sound like something I would ask," she admitted, not conceding, but acknowledging the alignment. Ethan inclined his head slightly. "You did not wait for my answer," he continued, his voice softer now, less controlled, more reflective. "You told me that success without memory is just a performance, and that one day, if I was not careful, I would wake up and realize I had built a life that did not belong to me." Naomi's chest tightened, the words landing with an unexpected weight, not because she remembered saying them, but because they felt true in a way she could not deny. "And then what?" she asked quietly. Ethan's gaze flickered, just for a moment, something passing through it too quickly to fully name. "Then you left," he said, simple, direct, but carrying something unresolved beneath it. "You walked away before I could ask your name, before I could understand why you felt so familiar to me." Naomi frowned slightly. "The piece is not fitting." "Not yet, but you knew my name when you found me again," she pointed out. Ethan nodded. "Because I looked for you," he replied, without hesitation, without embellishment, just truth. "I spent months trying to find someone who might not even exist outside of that one night." Naomi's breath slowed, her mind trying to process the persistence, the certainty behind his words. "And then," he continued, 3 months later, I saw you again." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disbelief, but in focus. "Where?" she asked. Ethan held her gaze, steady, unwavering. "In a hospital in Brooklyn." The words landed differently, heavier, more grounded. Naomi's pulse quickened, just slightly. Something about that detail brushing against the edges of something she could almost reach. "You were there for someone else," he added. "You were not dressed like this." His eyes flickered briefly to her current outfit, then back to her face. "You looked exhausted, but you still stopped to help a stranger in the hallway. You did not even think about it. You just did it." Naomi's lips parted slightly, her breath catching as a faint image flickered at the edge of her mind. not clear, not complete, but enough to make her feel unsteady. And you did not recognize me, Ethan finished. His voice quieter now, not bitter, not accusing, just stating what was. Naomi swallowed, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides. Because I had never met you, she said, but the certainty in her voice had softened, just enough to reveal the fracture beneath it. Ethan did not argue, did not correct her, he simply stepped closer, closing the distance just enough for his presence to feel undeniable. That is what I thought too, he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying something deeper now, something unresolved. Until I saw that dress again. Naomi's gaze snapped to his, confusion flickering across her face. What dress? She asked. Ethan lifted the photograph slightly, holding it between them once more. The one you are wearing in this picture, he said, his eyes searching hers, not for recognition, but for something else, something he had not yet found. Because the woman I saw in Chicago, he added slowly, is the same woman I saw in Brooklyn. His voice dropped just slightly, almost to a whisper, and she is standing in front of me now. Naomi felt it then, not a memory, not a clear image, but a shift, something beneath the surface beginning to move, something that did not belong to logic or explanation, something that made her question not just the photograph, but herself. She looked at him, really looked at him, at the certainty in his eyes, at the restraint in his posture, at the quiet intensity that did not feel like manipulation, but like someone holding onto a truth he could not prove. And for the first time, she did not try to deny it. She simply asked, her voice steady but softer than before, if you have been looking for me all this time, she said, then why did you choose a contract instead of the truth? For a moment, the city outside seemed to dim, as if even the lights understood the weight of her question. Ethan did not answer immediately, and that silence said more than anything he could have spoken too quickly. His gaze lowered slightly, not in avoidance, but in calculation, as if he were choosing between two truths and neither one came without consequence. Naomi stood still, her arms relaxed at her sides now, but her presence unshaken. She was no longer reacting, she was waiting, and that quiet patience carried a power he could not ignore. Because the truth requires something I was not sure you would give me, he said finally, his voice calm but edged with something more honest than before. Naomi's brow lifted slightly, not offended, not surprised, but curious in a way that sharpened her attention. And what is that? She asked. Ethan met her eyes fully now, no distance, no deflection. Belief, he said, the word simple, but heavy with meaning. Naomi let out a quiet breath, something almost like a soft laugh escaping her, though there was no humor in it. You are right, she replied, her tone even, composed. I would not have believed you. Ethan nodded once, accepting that without resistance. Exactly, he said, then stepped closer, not invading her space, but no longer maintaining the calculated distance he had before. So I gave you something you could understand. He continued, terms, structure, control. Something that made sense in the world you remember. Naomi's gaze flickered briefly, the phrasing not lost on her. The world I remember, she repeated quietly, as if testing the shape of those words. Ethan did not correct her, but he did not confirm it either. He simply held her gaze, steady, grounded, and in that world, he said, you chose this. Naomi felt that land differently, not as a manipulation, but as a reflection. Because it was true, she had signed the contract, she had agreed to this arrangement without hesitation, without asking questions that now felt unavoidable. She inhaled slowly, then exhaled with control. Do not confuse my decision with your explanation, she said, her voice calm but firm. I chose stability, not mystery. Ethan's expression shifted slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition. And yet here you are, he replied, his tone quiet, almost contemplative, holding proof that something about your life is not as stable as you thought. Naomi's fingers curled slightly, the photograph still vivid in her mind, the emerald dress, the version of herself she could not place. She turned slightly, moving away from him just enough to create space to think, her gaze drifting back to the window, the reflection of the city stretching endlessly, constant, predictable, everything her life had been built on. You said I stopped you that night, she said after a moment, her voice softer now, less guarded. You said I asked you something that stayed with you. Ethan nodded once, silently encouraging her to continue. Then tell me this, she added, turning back to face him, her eyes steady, searching. Why did you not stop me from leaving? The question settled between them, direct, precise, and for the first time, Ethan's composure shifted in a way that could not be masked by control. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a brief hesitation, a flicker of something Unresolved, because you were not meant to stay, he said quietly. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. That sounds like something you tell yourself to make peace with losing someone, she replied. Ethan did not deny it. He simply stepped closer again, this time stopping just within the space where his presence could be felt without touch. Or it sounds like something someone learns when they realize they were not meeting a stranger, he said, his voice lower now, carrying a quiet intensity that did not demand, but lingered. Naomi held his gaze, unflinching, though something beneath her calm began to shift again, not fear, not confusion, but something closer to recognition without memory. Then what was I? She asked, the question quieter than before, but heavier. If I was not a stranger. Ethan's eyes softened, just slightly, enough to reveal something beneath the precision, something real. You were someone who already knew how my story would unfold, he said. Naomi felt her breath slow, her mind searching for meaning in words that felt both distant and strangely close. That does not make sense, she replied, though her voice lacked the certainty it once held. Ethan nodded slightly. Not yet, he said, then lifted the photograph once more, his gaze dropping to it for a brief moment before returning to her. But it will. Naomi watched him. The way he held onto that image as if it anchored him to something beyond logic, beyond explanation. And for the first time, she did not feel like she was standing outside of his truth. She felt like she was standing at the edge of it, and that realization unsettled her more than anything else. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, grounding herself in what she could control. Then we do this differently, she said, her voice regaining its clarity, its strength. Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly, attentive. No more half answers, she continued. No more decisions made for me based on what you think I will understand. She stepped closer now, matching his distance, her presence calm but undeniable. If there is a truth here, I want all of it. Ethan held her gaze, something shifting again, not resistance, not control, but consideration. And after a moment, he nodded once, slow, deliberate. Then tomorrow, he said, I will take you somewhere. Naomi's brow lifted slightly, cautious but not resistant. Where? She asked. Ethan's expression settled back into something quieter, more contained, but no longer distant. Somewhere you have already been, he replied, and this time, the silence that followed did not feel like uncertainty. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them could stop. The next morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if time itself had slowed in anticipation of something neither of them could fully name. Naomi stood by the window long before Ethan entered the room, her reflection led against the pale light of early Manhattan morning, the city below just beginning to stir, taxis moving like quiet pulses through the streets, people stepping into routines that made sense, routines that belonged to them. She folded her arms lightly, grounding herself in the familiar rhythm of breath and thought, but the image of the photograph lingered, sharp and impossible, pressing against the edges of everything she believed to be true. When she heard his footsteps, she did not turn immediately. She let him enter the space, let his presence settle before acknowledging it, because whatever this was, she refused to approach it with uncertainty. You said we are going somewhere, she said, her voice calm, steady, not questioning but confirming. Ethan stopped a few feet behind her, his reflection joining hers in the glass, his posture composed as always, but there was something different in the way he held himself, less guarded, less calculated, as if he had already made a decision he could not undo. We are, he replied simply. Naomi nodded once, then turned to face him, her gaze direct. Then let us not pretend this is casual, she said. If I have been there before, then whatever happened there matters more than anything you have told me so far. Ethan held her gaze, something unreadable flickering through his eyes before settling into quiet agreement. It does, he said, no hesitation, no deflection, just truth, and that alone shifted something between them, because for the first time, he was not managing the narrative, he was stepping into it with her. The drive was silent, not tense, but intentional. The kind of silence that did not avoid conversation but prepared for it. Naomi watched the city change as they moved further from the familiar skyline, the buildings lowering, the streets widening, the noise softening into something less defined. She did not ask where they were going, because she understood now that the destination mattered less than what it would reveal. After nearly 40 minutes, the car slowed, turning into a quiet street lined with older buildings, the kind that carried history without announcing it. Ethan stepped out first, then moved around to open her door, the gesture automatic, but this time it felt less like obligation and more like acknowledgement. Naomi stepped out, her eye scanning the area. Something about it stirring a faint sense of recognition she could not fully grasp. They walked side by side toward a building with a simple exterior, no grand signage, no indication of importance, just a quiet presence among everything else. Ethan paused at the entrance, his hand resting briefly against the door as if grounding himself. Then he looked at her, not asking permission, but offering a moment. Naomi met his gaze, her expression steady. "Do not stop now," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Ethan nodded once, then opened the door. The interior was calm, softly lit, the scent of antiseptic and quiet conversations drifting through the air. A hospital. Naomi felt it immediately, not as a place of fear, but as a place of memory, not conscious memory, but something deeper, something her body recognized before her mind could. She stepped inside, her movement slowing slightly as her eyes moved across the space, the hallway, the reception desk, the muted colors. Something about it pressed against her, not overwhelming, but persistent. Ethan stayed close, not guiding her, not leading, just present, allowing her to move at her own pace. "This is where you saw me," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, less controlled, more connected to the environment around her. Ethan nodded. "Yes," he replied, watching her carefully, not for confirmation, but for reaction. Naomi took another step forward, her gaze shifting toward a corridor to the left, her breath catching slightly as a faint image flickered in her mind, not clear, not complete, but enough to make her pause. "There," she said quietly, her hand lifting slightly, pointing toward the corridor without fully realizing she had done it. Ethan's expression changed, just slightly, something like recognition passing through his eyes. "That is the hallway," he said, his voice low, steady. Naomi swallowed, then moved forward, each step slower than the last, as if she were walking toward something fragile, something that could disappear if she moved too quickly. The hallway stretched ahead, identical doors lining each side, the soft hum of distant machines blending into the background. Naomi stopped halfway down, her chest tightening, her hand pressing lightly against her side as if grounding herself in the present. "I have been here," she said, not as a question, not as a guess, but as a realization. Ethan did not respond immediately, he simply watched her, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again, her gaze sharper now, more focused. "I was not alone," she added, her voice steady but quieter. Ethan's breath slowed, something shifting in his posture. "No," he confirmed. Naomi turned to him slowly, her expression no longer uncertain, but searching for something specific, something that had just moved from the edge of her awareness into something more tangible. "There was someone else," she said, and this time, it was not a guess, it was a fragment, incomplete but real. "Someone I was there for." Ethan nodded once, the confirmation silent but undeniable. Naomi's fingers curled slightly, her pulse steady but deeper now. "Then tell me," she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that had not been there before, "what happened to them?" The question did not rush him, it settled into the quiet space of the hallway like something that had been waiting far longer than either of them realized. Ethan looked past her for a brief moment, his gaze tracing the length of the corridor as if he could still see the night as it had been, not as it was now, softened by daylight and distance, but sharp with urgency and meaning. "They survived," he said finally, his voice steady but carrying a weight that suggested the word did not come easily. Naomi exhaled slowly, something in her chest loosening just slightly at that answer. Though the tension did not disappear, it shifted, becoming something more focused, more precise. "That is not the whole truth," she replied, her tone calm, not accusing, but certain. Ethan nodded once, accepting that without resistance. "No," he said, then stepped closer, his presence no longer measured by distance but by intention. "It is not." Naomi held his gaze, waiting, not pushing, but no longer allowing space for partial answers. Ethan's hand moved slightly, not reaching for her, but grounding himself in the moment. "You were here with your younger brother," he said, the words careful, deliberate. Naomi felt something inside her shift, not a memory, not yet, but a pull, a recognition that lived just beneath the surface. Her breath slowed, her focus sharpening. "He had been admitted earlier that day," Ethan continued. "You had been there for hours before I arrived." Naomi's fingers curled slightly at her sides, the faintest image flickering in her mind, a chair by a hospital bed, the quiet rhythm of machines, a hand held gently, but it slipped away before she could fully grasp it. "And when I saw you again," Ethan said, his voice quieter now, "you were not the same woman I met in Chicago." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in concentration. "How?" she asked, the word soft but anchored in something deeper than curiosity. Ethan's gaze softened just enough to reveal something beneath his control, something that did not belong to business or strategy. Because you were not speaking about possibility anymore, he said, you were holding on to something real, something fragile, and you were not afraid of losing it, you were afraid of not being there when it needed you. Naomi's chest tightened, the words landing somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere closer to instinct. I stayed, Ethan added, not because you asked me to, but because you did not need to. Naomi swallowed, her eyes drifting briefly down the hallway again, the space no longer unfamiliar, but not fully known either. What happened next? She asked, her voice steady, though quieter now. Ethan took a slow breath, then released it with control. There was a complication, he said, choosing the word carefully, avoiding anything that would fracture the calm she was holding on to. The doctors needed time, and you were the only constant in that room. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment, and this time the image lingered a second longer, a dim room, a hand in hers, a quiet promise she could not hear but could feel. Her breath caught, then steadied again. And you stayed too, she said, not as a question, but as an observation. Ethan nodded. I did, he confirmed, not because I understood what I was part of, but because I knew leaving would mean losing something I had not even begun to understand. Naomi opened her eyes again, her gaze finding his, steady but changed, less guarded, more aware. And my brother, she said, the word feeling unfamiliar and familiar at the same time. Ethan held her gaze, not avoiding, not softening the truth. He recovered, he said, but not without leaving something behind. Naomi's brow furrowed slightly, her focus sharpening. What do you mean? She asked. Ethan hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of care, as if the next truth required precision. You made a decision that night, he said slowly, one that changed more than just his outcome. Naomi felt her pulse shift, not faster, but deeper, heavier. What decision? She asked, her voice steady but carrying something new now, something closer to urgency. Ethan stepped closer, just enough for his presence to feel anchored beside her, not overwhelming, not controlling, just there. You chose to carry something for him, he said. Naomi's breath stilled for a fraction of a second, her mind reaching for meaning, for context, for anything that could complete the shape of those words. What does that mean? She asked quietly. Ethan's gaze did not waver, but there was something in it now, something that had not been there before, something unguarded. It means, he said, his voice low, controlled, but no longer distant, that the reason you do not remember me is because you chose not to remember that night at all. The word settled into the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. Naomi stood still, her body grounded in the present, but her mind shifting, opening, as if something long closed had just been touched, not fully revealed, but no longer hidden. She looked at him, really looked at him, searching not for answers, but for truth, and for the first time, she did not ask him to prove it. She simply asked, her voice quiet but unwavering, then why does it feel like I am starting to remember now? Naomi did not move, but something within her did, subtle at first, like a shift beneath the surface of still water. Her breath slowed, not because she was calming herself, but because her body was responding to something her mind had not yet caught up to. Ethan watched her carefully, not stepping closer, not interrupting, because he understood now that whatever was happening did not belong to him to control. It belonged to her, because memory is not always lost, he said quietly, his voice steady but softer than before. Sometimes it is just waiting for a reason to return. Naomi's eyes remained fixed on a point just beyond him, as if she were looking through the present into something deeper, something layered beneath the reality she had built for herself. Her fingers lifted slightly, then curled again, grounding herself as a faint image flickered, this time clearer. A hospital room, dim light, a chair pulled too close to a bed, her hand wrapped around someone else's, smaller, weaker, but still there, still holding on. Her chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. He was afraid, she said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Ethan's gaze sharpened, not in surprise, but in confirmation. Naomi blinked, her focus shifting, her breath catching as the image lingered a moment longer. But he did not want me to see it, she added, her voice steady but quieter, as if she were speaking to the memory itself. Ethan nodded once, slowly. That is right, he said, his voice careful, not leading, just acknowledging. Naomi turned her head slightly, her eyes finding his again, but this time they were different, not searching for answers, but holding fragments of them, incomplete but real. I told him something, she said, more to herself than to him. Ethan did not interrupt, he simply waited. Naomi's brow furrowed as she tried to hold onto the thread of the memory before it slipped away again. I told him that fear does not get to decide the ending, she said, her voice gaining strength as the words settled into place. Ethan exhaled slowly, something in his posture easing, not because the situation had resolved, but because the truth was beginning to surface. You said that to me too, he added quietly. Naomi's eyes flickered, the connection landing in a way that felt both distant and immediate. She took a step back, not away from him, but deeper into the space of her own thoughts, her mind moving faster now, not in panic, but in alignment, pieces beginning to connect in ways they had not before. You were there longer than you said, she said, her tone sharpening slightly as clarity began to replace uncertainty. Ethan's expression remained steady, but he did not deny it. I was, he admitted. Naomi's gaze narrowed slightly, not in accusation, but in focus. You did not just watch, she continued, you stayed because something happened after. Ethan's silence confirmed it more than any words could. Naomi's breath deepened, her body responding to the shift as another fragment surfaced, stronger this time. A hallway. This hallway, her steps unsteady, her mind racing, a decision forming, heavy, unavoidable. There was a choice, she said, her voice low, controlled, but carrying something deeper now. Ethan stepped closer, not to interrupt, but to anchor himself to the moment. Yes, he said, his tone quiet but firm. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second, and this time the memory did not disappear, it expanded, not fully, but enough to reveal its shape. A conversation, not with Ethan, but with someone else, a doctor, calm but direct, explaining something that required more than time, more than waiting, something that required sacrifice. Her breath caught, her hand lifting slightly to her chest as if steadying herself. I agreed to something, she said, the words barely above a whisper, but unmistakable. Ethan's gaze softened, not with pity, but with respect. You did, he confirmed. Naomi opened her eyes again, her gaze clearer now, sharper, not because she understood everything, but because she understood enough. And after that, she continued slowly, everything changed. Ethan nodded once, the truth sitting between them. Without resistance, Naomi looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him not just in the present, but as part of something that had already happened, something she had chosen to leave behind. You were there when I made that choice, she said. Ethan did not hesitate this time. I was, he answered. Naomi's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in realization. And I asked you to do something, she added, her voice steady but carrying the weight of something she was only now beginning to understand. Ethan's gaze did not waver, but there was something in it now, something deeper, something that had been held back until this moment. You did, he said quietly. Naomi took a slow breath, her posture straightening as the final piece of the moment surfaced, not as a full memory, but as a truth she could feel even without seeing every detail. I asked you to let me forget, she said, the words landing with a quiet finality that changed everything. Ethan closed his eyes for just a fraction of a second, then opened them again, his expression no longer guarded, no longer controlled, but real. Yes, he said, his voice steady but softer than it had ever been. Naomi held his gaze, the space between them no longer defined by distance or uncertainty, but by something else entirely, something that had existed before either of them fully understood it. And as she stood there, in the place her memory had once abandoned, she realized that forgetting had not erased the truth, it had only delayed it, and now, with every breath, it was coming back. The hallway no longer felt like a place she had entered, it felt like a place she had returned to, not fully, not completely, but enough for the air to carry meaning instead of emptiness. Naomi stood still, her breathing steady but deeper now, as if each inhale pulled something old closer to the surface. Ethan did not speak. He understood that whatever came next had to come from her, not from him, because this was no longer about explanation. It was about recognition. I asked you to let me forget, she repeated, the words quieter this time, but heavier, as if saying them again anchored them into something real. Ethan's gaze remained on her, not pressing, not questioning, just present. Naomi turned slowly, her eyes tracing the hallway again, but now she was not searching for clues, she was following something internal, something that had begun to align without her permission. Her steps were slow, measured, as she moved further down the corridor, stopping in front of a door she did not consciously choose, but recognized anyway. Her hand hovered near the handle, not touching it, just close enough to feel the weight of what it represented. This room, she said softly, her voice carrying a certainty that did not come from memory, but from something deeper. Ethan nodded once behind her, his presence steady. Yes, he confirmed. Naomi's fingers brushed lightly against the door, and in that small, quiet contact, something shifted again, not a full memory, not a complete scene, but a fragment, clearer than before, a chair beside the bed, her voice low, steady, promising something she could not fully hear now, but could feel in the way her chest tightened. I told him I would stay, she said, her eyes closing briefly as the feeling lingered. Ethan watched her carefully, not interrupting, because he knew that pushing too soon would break the fragile connection forming in front of him. Naomi opened her eyes again, her gaze moving slowly to Ethan, not lost, not uncertain, but changed. And I could not, she added, her voice steady but carrying something deeper now, something closer to grief than confusion. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in denial, but in acknowledgement. No, he said quietly. Naomi inhaled slowly, her posture straightening as the pieces began to form a clearer picture, not complete, but undeniable. So I made a different promise, she continued, her tone calm but firm. Ethan did not look away, even as the weight of that truth settled between them. You asked me to take care of him, he said, completing the thought she had not yet spoken aloud. Naomi's breath caught, not in surprise, but in recognition. She nodded once, slowly. Because I knew I would not be able to, she said, her voice steady, but the words carried a quiet finality that echoed beyond the hallway. Ethan stepped closer, just enough for his presence to feel grounded beside her, not to interrupt, but to stand within the truth she was uncovering. You trusted me with something that was never mine to carry, he said, not as a question, but as a realization he had lived with since that night. Naomi turned fully toward him now, her eyes clear, focused, no longer searching for fragments, but holding onto them as they formed something real. No, she said softly, I trusted you with something I could not carry anymore. The distinction settled between them, precise and undeniable. Ethan held her gaze, something shifting in his expression, not control, not distance, but something closer to vulnerability, something that had been held back until now. And then you asked me for one more thing, he said quietly. Naomi's brow furrowed slightly, the memory not fully formed, but the weight of it unmistakable. I asked you to let me forget, she repeated again, but this time it was not a question, not even a realization, it was a truth she could feel settling into place. Ethan nodded once, his voice low, steady. You said that if you remembered, you would not be able to move forward. Naomi's breath slowed, the words aligning with something deep inside her, something she had built her life around without knowing why. So you made sure I could, she said, her eyes holding his, not accusing, not blaming, but understanding. Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his posture did, something that had been held tight now loosening just slightly. I did what you asked, he said. Naomi studied him for a moment, really studied him, not as the man she had married under a contract, not as the man who had watched her from a distance, but as someone who had been part of something she had chosen to leave behind. And in that moment, the space between them shifted again, not defined by what she had forgotten, but by what was returning. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as the weight of the unknown transformed into something she could begin to understand. And now I am remembering, she said, her voice calm, but carrying a quiet strength that had always been there. Ethan nodded. Not surprised, not resisting, just accepting. Yes, he said. Naomi held his gaze, steady, grounded, no longer uncertain. Then this time, she added, her tone firm but quiet, I will not ask you to take anything away from me. The word settled into the space between them, not as a challenge, not as a demand, but as a decision. And for the first time since this began, Ethan did not look like a man controlling a situation. He looked like someone standing inside it, with her, as whatever came next moved forward without either of them trying to stop it. They stood in the quiet of the hallway, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It carried weight, direction, something that moved forward instead of holding them back. Naomi did not look at the door again. She had already taken what she needed from it, not the full memory, not every detail, but enough to understand that what she had left behind was never truly gone. It had only been waiting. And now it was no longer something to avoid, it was something to face. She turned slowly, her steps measured as she moved back toward the center of the hallway. Ethan following without speaking, without leading, just present in the same space, no longer ahead of her, no longer behind. When they reached the end of the corridor, Naomi stopped, her gaze lifting toward the soft light filtering through the windows at the far end, the outside world moving as if nothing had changed, but everything had. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, not because the weight had disappeared, but because she understood it now, and understanding made it easier to carry. "You stayed," she said quietly, not turning to him yet. Ethan did not hesitate. "I did," he replied. Naomi nodded once, her expression calm but thoughtful. "Not because of a contract," she continued, "not because of obligation." Ethan's gaze remained steady. "No," he said. Naomi finally turned to face him, her eyes clear, focused, no longer searching for fragments, but holding on to the truth as it stood. "You stayed because you chose to," she said. Ethan held her gaze, something shifting in the quiet space between them, something no longer hidden behind logic or control. "Yes," he answered, simple, direct, without defense. Naomi studied him for a moment, not as a stranger, not as a man bound to her by agreement, but as someone who had already stood beside her once before, someone who had carried something for her without asking for recognition, without expecting anything in return, and for the first time, she saw him not as part of a mystery, but as part of her story. She took a slow breath, then spoke again, her voice steady, grounded. "Then you understand what I am about to say." Ethan's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened. "Say it," he replied. Naomi stepped closer, not hesitating, not calculating, just moving with the certainty she had been rebuilding piece by piece. "The contract is not enough anymore," she said, the words calm, but final in a way that did not need to be raised to be heard. Ethan did not react immediately, but something in his posture shifted, not in resistance, but in acknowledgement. "I know," he said, and this time, there was no distance in his voice. Naomi's gaze held his, unwavering. "I will not live in something that was designed to protect me from a truth I am already facing," she continued, "and I will not let you stand beside me under conditions that no longer reflect what is actually here." Ethan exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in hesitation, but in acceptance of something he had known would come, even if he had not known when. "Then what do you want?" he asked, his voice quiet, steady. Naomi did not look away, not even for a second. "I want choice," she said. "Not something written in clauses, not something defined by what I do not remember. I want to choose what happens next with everything I know now." The words settled between them, not as a demand, but as a declaration. Ethan studied her, really studied her. The way she held herself, the way her voice carried both calm and conviction, the way she stood not as someone trying to recover what was lost, but as someone deciding what came next. And in that moment, something in him shifted as well, not a breaking, not a loss of control, but a release of it. "Then we end the contract," he said, the word simple, but carrying weight. Naomi nodded once, her expression steady. "Yes," she replied, and for a brief moment, the space between them was quiet again. But not uncertain, not unresolved, just paused, as if both of them understood that something had ended, and something else had not yet been defined. Ethan reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, pulling out the wallet, the same one she had opened the night before, the photograph still inside. He looked at it for a brief second, then removed it, holding it between them, not as evidence, not as proof, but as something that had carried them to this point. Naomi's gaze dropped to the image, the emerald dress, the version of herself she had once been and was now beginning to understand. Ethan extended it toward her, his hand steady. "This belongs to you," he said. Naomi looked at the photograph, then back at him, her expression thoughtful, but not conflicted. She reached out, but instead of taking it immediately, she paused, her fingers hovering just above it. "No," she said softly. Ethan's brow lifted slightly, not in confusion, but in curiosity. Naomi met his gaze, her voice calm, certain. "That belongs to who I was," she said, then her hand moved, not taking the photograph, but gently closing his fingers around it again, returning it to him. "What happens next," she continued, her tone steady, "will not be based on something I had to forget." Ethan held her gaze, the photograph still in his hand, but no longer the center of what stood between them. Naomi took a small step back, not away from him, but into herself, into the space she had reclaimed. "If there is something here," she said, her voice softer now, but no less clear, "then it has to be built in the present, not remembered from the past." The word settled into the quiet, not as a rejection, not as a distance, but as something stronger, something that did not rely on what had been, but on what could be. Ethan watched her, not trying to hold on to the past, not trying to recreate it, but seeing her as she stood now, and for the first time, he did not look like a man trying to find something he had lost. He looked like someone being given the chance to choose it again, and this time, neither of them looked away.